Robert Downey Jr. sees his former acting coach struggling on the streets while driving back home. What he did says a lot about his character. The city hummed with its usual nighttime rhythm, neon lights flickering against the wet asphalt as the occasional car whispered by. Los Angeles never truly slept, but the energy was different at this hour, quieter. Robert Downey Jr. liked it. This way, the electric purr of his Audi e-tron sliced through the near-empty streets. It had been a long night, a charity gala, handshakes, speeches, the whole Hollywood routine. Smiles exchanged under chandeliers, cameras flashing in his face, people congratulating him for his success, for his comeback, for being Robert Downey Jr., the man who rose from the ashes. He was used to it by now, the applause, the admiration. But some nights like this one, it didn't sit right. Maybe it was the weight of the past, lingering in the corners of his mind. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Or maybe it was something else. The red light stretched longer than it should have. Robert tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, eyes wandering out the window. The street was nearly deserted. Just the occasional figure moving along the sidewalks, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Then he saw him. A hunched figure, sat on the cold pavement wrapped in a stained, tattered coat. His back rested against the wall of an old convenience store, its metal shutters locked up for the night. A shopping cart sat beside him, filled with things that probably meant everything to him, but nothing to anyone else. Robert exhaled slowly. Just another lost soul in the city. It was a sad reality. Los Angeles was full of them. He had gotten used to seeing it, but something held his gaze this time. Something in the way the man sat, the slope of his shoulders, the way he clutched the blanket around himself like armor against the world. There was something familiar. The light turned. Green. Robert's fingers curled tighter around the wheel. He had places to be, things to do. The rational part of his brain told him to keep driving. Instead, he slowed down. His foot hovered over the gas pedal. His heart beat faster. Why did this feel different? A car behind him honked. He blinked, startled, and the moment shattered. His instincts told him to go, just drive. But as he finally moved forward, something gnawed at his gut. Then, almost without thinking, he did something he hadn't planned. He pulled over. The engine hummed softly as he sat in silence, gripping the wheel, jaw clenched. Why am I doing this? For a few seconds, he just sat there, staring at the dashboard. He could still change his mind. He could still leave. But the feeling didn't go away. With a sigh, Robert unbuckled his seatbelt. The door swung open, and the night air rushed in, crisp and laced with the distant scent of rain. His shoes met the pavement with a quiet thud. The city buzzed softly in the background, tires rolling over asphalt, a distant siren wailing somewhere deep in the grid of streets. But in this small pocket of the night, it felt like the world had shrunk down to just him and the man sitting in the cold. Robert took a step forward, then another. As he got closer, details sharpened. The way the man's hair, streaked with gray, fell in tangled strands over his forehead, the lines on his face, etched deeper than time should allow. His hands, thin and frail, gripped the blanket like it was the last thing tethering him to this world. And then, his stomach twisted. Even under the dirt, the unshaven beard, the weary slump of his body, Robert knew that face. His breath caught. No, it couldn't be. The man shifted slightly, and in that tiny movement, the past slammed into Robert like a freight train. A dusty theater stage, a booming voice that once commanded a room, stern eyes that could see straight into a young actor's soul. Langford, his old acting coach. Robert froze. The city around him faded, the sounds dimmed, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. How the hell did this happen? Robert's breath came shallow, his pulse thudding in his ears. Langford, the man who had once stood in front of 100 wide-eyed students demanding passion, precision, truth. The man who could break an actor down with a single glare and rebuild them stronger with just a few words. The man who had seen something in Robert before he had even seen it in himself. And now, That same man sat slumped against a wall, lost in the cold embrace of the city's indifference. Robert swallowed hard. This didn't make sense. Langford was larger than life, unshakable, the kind of man who could stand in an empty theater and command it with just a whisper. And yet, here he was, forgotten, broken. The weight in Robert's chest tightened as he took another step closer. The sounds of the city blurred around him, just background noise against the deafening realization in his head. Langford didn't react at first. His body barely moved, his breath slow and shallow. Did he even recognize him? Robert crouched down, lowering himself to the man's level. He hesitated for a second before speaking, his voice quieter than he expected. Langford? No response. The name lingered in the air, swallowed by the night. Robert tried again, this time softer. Langford. It's me. A flicker, just a small one. The slightest twitch of movement beneath tired, half-closed eyelids. The fingers that clutched the blanket tightened, just barely. Robert's stomach twisted. He heard me, a gust of wind passed through the street, rattling a loose piece of newspaper across the pavement. The cold bit at Robert's skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the frail figure in front of him. Then finally, Langford stirred. His head tilted slightly, eyes blinking slowly as if surfacing from a deep, unreachable place. The shadows under his eyes were dark, the skin stretched thin over his cheekbones. He looked like a man who had been fighting a battle for too long, a battle he had already lost. His gaze lifted, searching, unfocused. And then, it happened. Recognition. It was faint, like a flame struggling against the wind, but it was there. The clouded eyes settled on Robert's face, brows creasing in confusion. For a second, Robert thought he might not remember him at all, that too much time had passed, that the years had erased whatever connection they once had. But then, a hoarse whisper, weak, barely audible. Downey? Robert's chest tightened. The way he said it, not Robert, not Kid, but Downey. The same way he had always called him back in the day. The same name that had boomed across theater halls when Robert was just a restless, arrogant student, desperate to prove himself. Robert exhaled, trying to steady his voice. Yeah, it's me. Langford blinked again, his breath shaky, his lips parting slightly as if trying to process what was in front of him. What are you doing here? Robert let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. I could ask you the same thing. A heavy silence settled between them. Langford's eyes flickered, with something unreadable, shame maybe, or disbelief. Then, just as quickly, his gaze dropped, his shoulders curling inward as if trying to disappear into himself. You shouldn't have stopped. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. No, this isn't right. This was Langford, his mentor. The man who had shaped him, challenged him, pushed him beyond every limit he thought he had. This wasn't how his story was supposed to go. Robert studied him, really studied him. The tattered coat, the calloused hands, the hollowness. In his face like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be seen. And something inside Robert snapped. His voice was firmer this time. I'm not just gonna walk away, Langford. The older man let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing weakly against the fabric of his blanket. His lips parted as if to argue. But he didn't. He just closed his eyes. And in that moment, Robert knew. This was going to be harder than he thought. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. Robert crouched there waiting, but Langford wouldn't look at him. His head stayed down, his fingers tightening around the frayed edges of his blanket. The streetlight overhead flickered, casting shadows across his worn-out features. Robert's chest felt heavy. This was wrong. This wasn't the Langford he knew. He had been a force of nature, booming voice, sharp mind, a man who could reduce a room full of actors to silence with just a glance, and now he was just tired. Robert ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. Langford, he tried again, his voice softer this time. Look at me. A pause. Then, finally, Langford shifted. His eyes, dull and unfocused, slowly lifted to meet Robert's. And just like that, Robert was 18 again, that same piercing stare, the one that saw through every excuse, every insecurity, every half-hearted attempt at being something more. He remembered standing on that small stage, sweating, under the stage lights, a script shaking in his hands. He had been cocky back then, convinced he knew it all. But Langford had seen right through him. Drop the act, Downey, feel it. You either live in the moment or you don't belong on that stage. Robert had hated him for that, until the moment he realized Langford was the only one who truly believed in him. The memory faded, the present slamming back into focus. This wasn't a stage. There were no scripts, no rehearsals. Just a man who had given up. Langford let out a slow, shuddering breath. I wasn't expecting to see you again. Robert Ain gave a small shake of his head. Yeah, well, neither was I. Langford's lips curved into something that might have been a smile in another life. Bet you thought I'd be in some grand theater by now, huh? His voice was hoarse, cracked from years of hardship. Maybe directing some Shakespeare. Production. Training the next generation of Hollywood elites. Robert didn't answer. Because, honestly, yeah, that's exactly what he thought. Langford let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Life's funny like that. Robert felt his jaw tighten. What happened? Langford's eyes flickered away. He didn't answer. Robert waited. He had always been impatient, always wanted quick answers. But something told him this wasn't a moment to push. Instead, he sat down. Right there on the cold pavement, beside the man who had once taught him how to bring stories to life. Langford side-eyed him, his brow furrowing. What are you doing? Robert shrugged. You look like crap, Langford. If you think I'm just gonna drive off and pretend I didn't see you like this, you really don't know me. Langford let out a breath, his fingers twitching. His voice dropped lower. I don't want your pity, kid. Robert's lips twitched at the word kid. Even after all these years, it's not pity. He hesitated before adding, it's respect. Langford went still. His breathing slowed. He stared at the pavement for a long time before finally whispering, I don't deserve that. And that hit Robert harder than anything, because if there was one person in the world who deserved respect, it was Langford. And now, somehow, he had convinced himself otherwise. Langford's words sat heavy between them. I don't deserve that. Robert studied him in silence, his mind trying to piece together the missing years. The once great acting coach, now a man who barely had the strength to lift his head. This wasn't just bad luck. This was something deeper. Langford shifted uncomfortably under Robert's gaze, as if he could feel the weight of the unspoken questions. His fingers twitched around the blanket, his body curling inward. Robert exhaled. I need you to tell me what happened. Langford let out a dry, humorless laugh. Does it matter? Robert's jaw tightened. It does to me. A long pause. Then finally, Langford's shoulders sagged. I tried. The words were barely above a whisper. Tried to keep the theater going. Thought I had enough left in me to teach one more generation. His lips curled bitterly. Turns out the industry doesn't have much use for old men who don't bring in box office numbers. Robert's throat tightened. He could see it now, the slow unraveling. A man who had spent his whole life giving to others, only to be left with nothing. When he needed someone to give back, Langford continued, his voice distant. I lost the lease, couldn't keep up, burned through savings trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through my fingers. He shook his head. And after that? Well, the city doesn't wait for anyone. Robert didn't speak. What could he say? That he should have been there? That he should have checked in? That it wasn't fair? Of course it wasn't fair. But Langford didn't need empty words. Langford let out a slow breath. And before you ask, no, I didn't tell anyone. No calls for help. No desperate letters to old students. His eyes finally met Robert's, hollow and tired. I didn't want to be someone's burden. The word stung, because Robert knew that feeling. He had spent years drowning in his own demons, pushing people away, convincing himself he had to fight alone. He had been lucky. He got a second chance. But what if no one had shown up for him? His chest tightened. You were never a burden, Langford. The older man chuckled weakly. That's what people say when they feel guilty. Robert's fingers curled into fists. No, this wasn't how this story ended. Robert leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked onto Langford's hollow stare. I don't feel guilty. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. I feel pissed off. Langford let out a tired breath, shaking his head. No one's to blame for this, Downey, but Robert wasn't buying it. Really? No one? His jaw tightened. Not the people who turned their backs on you? Not the industry that chewed you up and spat you out? Langford gave him a knowing look. That's life, kid. Robert exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together to shake off the frustration. That's bullshit. Langford let out a weak chuckle. Same old Downey, still carrying the weight of the world on those shoulders. Robert smirked, but there was no humor in it. You taught me to care. His voice softened. You taught me everything. Langford's gaze flickered, something breaking through the exhaustion. Maybe surprise, maybe something else. Robert swallowed hard. You didn't let me give up on myself. His voice dropped lower. So I'm not gonna let you give up either. Langford tensed. I'm not your responsibility. Robert shook his head. It's not about responsibility. It's about respect. About paying back what's owed. Langford scoffed, though there was no real bite to it. Owed, kid, you don't owe me anything. Robert held his stare. I owe you everything. Silence, heavy, suffocating. Langford looked away first. His fingers flexed, gripping the blanket like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. Robert let the quiet stretch before speaking again. Let me help you, Langford. Just this once. The older man sighed, shaking his head. You don't get it. It's too late. Robert frowned. Too late for what? Langford's lips pressed into a thin line. His voice came out quieter. For fixing this. Robert leaned in, his voice firm. You're still here. That means it's not too late. Langford closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He looked tired. So damn tired. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Just once. Barely a movement. But Robert saw it, and for the first time that night, he felt hope. Robert didn't waste time. The moment Langford gave that small nod, he was already on his feet. Come on. Langford didn't move. His fingers curled tighter around the blanket, his body stiff like stone. Doubt was creeping back in. Where? His voice was rough, uncertain. Robert crossed his arms. Anywhere but here. Langford exhaled, shaking his head. I don't. Just for a few hours, Robert cut in. A warm place, food, no commitments, just. He hesitated, then softened his tone. Just say yes. Langford stared. At him for a long moment. His body language screamed resistance, but deep in his eyes there was something else. A flicker. The smallest ember of a man who once commanded a room with his presence. Then, finally, he sighed and nodded. Robert didn't smile, didn't celebrate, he just moved. Carefully he reached down, gripping Langford's arm. The man was lighter than he should have been. His body was frail, too thin under the layers of fabric he had wrapped himself in for warmth. Langford grunted as he stood, wobbling slightly. Robert steadied him with a firm grip on his shoulder. All right? Langford swallowed, nodding once. Yeah. Robert led him toward his car, taking slow steps, keeping pace. Every step felt like a battle. The world around them kept moving. Cars passed. Pedestrians walked by, some stealing glances, some not even noticing. No one knew who Langford was. No one cared, but Robert did. They reached the car and Langford hesitated before getting in. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, staring at his reflection in the window. I look like hell. Robert smirked. Nah, you look like someone about to get a second chance. Langford snorted softly. Then finally he got in. Robert shut. the door and took a deep breath before walking around to the driver's side. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city stretched out before them, neon lights reflecting off the windshield. Langford shifted in his seat. "Where are we going?" Robert kept his eyes on the road. "Somewhere with coffee." Langford let out a slow breath, staring out the window. "I don't know how to do this." Robert's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "You don't have to?" He glanced at him. "Just take the first step." Langford didn't answer, but he didn't argue either, and for now that was enough. The small diner wasn't anything special, just a quiet 24-hour spot on the outskirts of downtown. The kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the food was always greasy, and no one asked too many questions. Perfect. Robert pulled into the lot and cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Langford stared out the window, fingers twitching in his lap. His body was still, but Robert could feel the hesitation radiating off him. "We don't have to do this," Langford muttered. Robert glanced at him. "Yeah, we do." A pause. Then, with a tired sigh, Langford reached for the door handle and stepped out. The bell over the entrance jingled as they walked in. The warmth hit instantly, chasing away the chill from the streets. The air smelled like coffee, eggs, and something fried. A waitress glanced up from behind the counter, eyeing them briefly before going back to wiping down menus. They slid into a booth near the window. Langford moved carefully, like someone who wasn't used to sitting anywhere comfortable. A waitress appeared, flipping open a notepad. "What can I get you?" Robert didn't hesitate. "2 coffees, and whatever's warm and filling." Langford shot him a look but didn't argue. As the waitress walked away, Robert leaned back. "You ever think about acting again?" Langford scoffed. "Not in a long time." Robert studied him. "Why not?" Langford chuckled dryly. "You don't get it, Downey. That part of my life is over." "Says who?" Langford exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I burned too many bridges. No one's waiting for me to make a comeback." Robert smirked. "You didn't wait for me, but I made one anyway." That made Langford pause. His fingers tapped against the table, eyes distant. Waitress returned with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Langford wrapped his hands around his, soaking in the warmth. For the first time that night, his shoulders seemed to relax. Robert took a sip and watched him. There was still something there. It wasn't gone, just buried. After a long moment, Langford sighed. "And what if I fail?" Robert didn't blink. "And what if you don't?" Langford stared at him. The question hung in the air, lingering, challenging. For the first time in years, he actually considered it. The coffee had gone cold, but neither of them seemed to notice. Langford sat in silence, his fingers wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. Robert let him sit with the question. "What if you don't fail?" No pressure, no speeches. Just a thought, one that had been missing for far too long. Finally, Langford let out a slow breath. "What are you suggesting exactly?" Robert shrugged. "I know some people. A buddy of mine runs a community theater program. They need coaches, mentors. You wouldn't be stepping into a Hollywood set, but..." He trailed off, watching Langford's expression shift. It was subtle, a flicker of something. Hope. Langford exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know, Downey. What's the worst that could happen?" Langford huffed. "I embarrass myself. I realize I really am washed up." Robert smirked. "Or you realize you've still got it." The silence stretched again. Then, it's barely noticeable, but it was there. Robert didn't push. He just pulled out his phone and sent a quick message. A few minutes later, he looked up. "They have a class tomorrow. We'll go together." Langford sighed, but this time, there was something lighter about it. A hesitation, not a refusal. "One class," Robert grinned. "That's all I'm asking." A few months later, the small theater hummed with life. Young actors ran lines, practicing with exaggerated movements, their voices filling the space. Robert leaned against the doorway, watching. On stage, Langford stood tall again. His presence was different now, stronger, more alive. He wasn't the same man Robert had found on that street. His hair was neater, his face had color again, and his voice. It still had that power. No, no, no. You're not saying the line. You're feeling it. Langford's booming voice cut through the chatter, and the student straightened instinctively. Robert smirked. There he is. Langford turned, catching Robert's eye from across the room. A small nod. No words needed. Robert just smiled, pushing off the doorframe. As he walked away, he didn't need to look back to know. Langford was exactly where he was supposed to be. Robert stepped out into the cool evening air, hands in his pockets, listening to the faint echoes of Langford's voice inside the theater. He had been right. Langford didn't need saving. He just needed someone to remind him that he wasn't lost. And maybe, just maybe, that's all any of us ever need. What do you think? Have you ever had a mentor who changed your life? Or maybe you were the person who believed in someone when they had nothing left. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around. Because stories like these remind us that second chances aren't just possible, they're necessary. See you in the next one.